Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's event, The Conservative Weaponization of Government Against Tech. The recent backlash against big tech has come from both sides of the aisle, with conservative anti-tech sentiment showing up in state laws governing social media in Florida, Texas, Louisiana, and more, as well as in Project 2025, the Heritage Foundation's blueprint for the future of conservative policy. While advocating for small government and a hands-off regulatory approach in many other areas, anti-tech conservatives also argue for breaking up big tech, banning TikTok, and scrapping Section 230, relying on many of the same arguments that anti-tech liberals use. Tech is addictive, harmful to children, detrimental to free speech and privacy, and responsible for bias and political division. With the election fast approaching, it seems that no matter the outcome, big tech won't escape this backlash, which is why we're here today to discuss how anti-tech conservatives would weaponize the government against technology, the legitimacy of their anti-tech arguments, and the implications of their proposals for society. My name is Ash Johnson, and I'm a Senior Policy Manager for the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. Very quickly, I'd like to welcome everyone in our online audience. We'll be taking audience questions near the end of the event. So wherever you're watching, you can follow the link to Slido in the description to submit your questions. And don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and turn on notifications if that's where you're watching. Joining me today to talk about this conservative techlash, I have Jennifer Huddleston, Senior Fellow at the Cato Institute, a think tank advocating for individual liberty, Jeffrey Wessling, Director of Technology and Innovation Policy at the American Action Forum, an advocacy group leading the center-right on economic, domestic, and fiscal policy issues, and Josh Withrow, Resident Fellow on Technology and Innovation at R Street, a think tank focused on solving public policy challenges through free markets and limited government. Welcome, everyone, today. Lots to cover in today's webinar, and hopefully we'll be able to have future discussions around some of these issues as well. But I want to start with terminology. Conservative and liberal are both such broad terms that encompass a variety of different values and beliefs. We're talking about really a whole spectrum here. But when we're talking about anti-tech sentiment, especially here in the US, what values and beliefs is that typically associated with? And I want to start with Jennifer.
So I think on the right, we've certainly seen a lot of anti-tech sentiment kind of grow out of this idea of populism, the kind of response that we saw from people like President Trump, as well as from certain senators like Josh Hawley and J.D. Vance to some degree, that kind of shifts away from the more traditional free market conservatism that was associated with things like the consumer welfare standard, with things like the idea that on free speech issues, you have a marketplace of ideas, and is much more willing to use the government as a potential tool for intervention to fit certain policy ideas or policy positions they believe it should support. On the left, similarly, I think we've seen this from a certain strand of what could be termed progressivism, liberal with a lowercase l. I think of something that more resembles libertarianism, something that supports a broad range of options when it comes to the free market and free ideas in the tech space. But we've seen this push, from folks like Senator Elizabeth Warren, FTC Chair Lena Khan, to really particularly focus on some of the size of tech companies, the kind of idea that big in a marketplace is automatically bad, should automatically be treated with suspicion, is automatically negatively impacting consumers, rather than really looking at the kind of underlying economics of what's going on and whether these companies are large and successful because they're serving consumers well, and that's something to be applauded, or if this is something where we're seeing calls for, a lot of government intervention into these companies just because of their success rather than any kind of actual consumer harm.
So how did we get here? How did this backlash against big tech that we've typically associated with liberals or progressives gain a foothold among a certain subset of conservatives? And I want to start with Jeffrey for this one.
Yeah, happy to jump in. And I think it ties into Jen's answer on the first question. And just to build on that before I get to your question, I think another aspect of this, and it's implied in the answer, is that there's this element of power that these anti-tech conservatives are concerned with. They don't like, at least as the argument goes, they don't like having too much power in any one institution. And for the longest time, and for a lot of us on the panel, that means the power from the government to control what people can say, what people can do. But I'm seeing a lot of conservatives, Republicans that are saying the power of these big tech companies is just as bad. And that makes little sense to me, but you can at least see where they're coming from. They're saying these speech platforms have the ability to moderate content. They have the power to silence voices that they maybe disagree with, which again, I don't think is actually happening, but it's something you definitely feel as a user if your post gets censored. And I think to answer your question, that's where a lot of this is coming from. A lot of it is coming from this idea that we have these companies and they control these large platforms for speech. And inherently in all of our beliefs, we love free speech. We love the idea. And free speech in the US is mainly against government intervening and limiting what people can and cannot say. But there's this wing in the Republican Party, this conservative movement that sees the power to moderate content on large platforms and sees whenever there's a conservative post that maybe gets taken down or you get more conservative commentators banned, that it's targeted towards them. And I think that's really what started the techlash. I don't think that's the only thing that's causing it to continue to grow. I think a lot of what Jen talked about with antitrust and a lot of these different issues is starting to really prop up. But it really seemed to me to really start because of some of these moderation issues where we would see what conservatives felt like was a biased approach to moderation. And then it got built on with government agencies, government actors trying to weigh in and influence those decisions. And now we've kind of gotten to a point where there's this confluence of government actors who are saying we should be targeting misinformation, disinformation, and conservatives are seeing that as, oh, they're trying to target our speech. And I don't think that that's necessarily true, but there's definitely some overlap. And that's what some of these Supreme Court cases have been about, is some of these job owning aspects of it. And just to circle it all back together, I think that's kind of where it started and where it's coming from, is just this idea that conservatives feel like they're the ones who don't have the power and are being silenced by these large companies that do.
Josh, anything to add on those first two questions?
Not a ton. I would just say, I agree with both my colleagues here, and really to put a finer point on it, the real genesis of the fervor. I think there's been a little bit of a building in the zeitgeist of a little bit of a distrust of how these technology platforms are influencing society that's been happening over the last a decade or so. It's a typical anxiety that accompanies any sort of new revolution in technology that becomes mass adopted in society. But on the conservative side in particular, you had both the election of 2020, and then very shortly after it, or actually during that same period, you then had the response to the COVID pandemic and the pressure that was on platforms to regulate what sorts of dialogue about the virus, whether it was a lab leak or whether whether vaccines were effective, those kind of things. And the platforms, we came to find out later, were under intense pressure from government agencies to take down certain kinds of content as being misinformation or disinformation. And that was received by a lot of the public, but particularly by conservatives, as being sort of like the definitive moment where they went too far and demonstrated that they had the power to sort of shape public discourse. And the reaction to that was immediately, as soon as that stuff started happening, we started seeing policy responses at the state and federal level where conservative lawmakers were being pushed to do something about that. That was the changing moment.
And if I can just add before we move on from this question, I think while we are all discussing this with a very US focused lens and a very American approach to this issue, it is important to understand that this is a debate that's happening in a global context as well. And that's also relevant at times to the calls for regulation we hear both from conservatives or populists as well as from liberals or progressive, particularly when we look at, for example, what's going on with Europe's regulation of American tech companies. Things like the Digital Markets Act then kind of make their way into US policymakers' rhetoric sometimes. Similarly, when we look at the Digital Services Act and its impact on speech in Europe, they don't have that First Amendment backstop. So some of the things that could come up in the US context don't come up in the European context, even though they can have that impact, or they can have kind of similar both political discourse around them or get brought to the states as part of these conversations, even though we know there have been real consequences for innovation, for speech, both domestically in Europe as well as with American companies that have been trying to provide services over there.
So we've covered some of the concerns that this growing anti-tech crowd within among conservatives have with technology when it comes to speech, censorship, bigness of companies. And I think a lot of these concerns are coming from very understandable places. Do any of you kind of share some of these concerns about the implications tech can have for speech or censorship or other concerns that conservatives have?
I'll jump in. I mean, I'll say I totally get the anger about how content moderation was handled, both with respect to, the previous elections and with COVID. I was totally in the camp of, I don't necessarily think that these companies have always behaved smartly, or even maybe sometimes responsibly with respect to that. Sometimes these companies were also slow to employ good measures to help, regulate what kind of content gets to children, for example. I think in general, the industry has gotten much better about that over time, and they're being very proactive now. But it took them a little bit of time to get there, and so there a lot of these concerns. I can totally understand where they're rooted, where they're coming from, and sometimes I even sympathize with the folks who are angry at the companies pretty deeply. But of course, I don't generally tend to agree with what they would do in response in terms of using the government to leverage its power to regulate their behavior.
And just to echo Josh, I think that, it is important to acknowledge there are times when companies have made content moderation calls that an individual might feel differently about, that they might feel had some element of bias within that call. But the response traditionally has been not to then call for government regulation of everyone's speech as a result, or to call for regulation of these private actors by the government. If we think about this in an offline context, if a coffee shop chooses to not allow a certain private event or to allow a certain private event, there's oftentimes a public response to that. And that's those Americans exercising their free speech right, their, voting with their dollar in terms of where they take their business. But we would have concerns about someone then say calling for regulations on what speech coffee shops must or must not host. I think when we think about this in the offline world, a lot of times it provides a better framework for what's that distinction between being mad about the decision a company made, not liking that decision, choosing to take your voice or your interest or your dollar to another platform, and actually calling for government regulation that would either mandate certain viewpoints with additional consequences, could raise further issues in terms of the First Amendment applications, as well as the ability of private actors to make business decisions, or of individuals to have these platforms available for free to have an opportunity to have their voices heard, and really kind of understanding why there's a difference in disagreeing with the decision and calling for government regulation as a result. I do think this is also, though, where that job owning question comes in. The concerns about the government pressure on platforms is a bit of a different issue. And that is something that does raise actual First Amendment concerns of, is this a case where we are seeing the government engaging in what a Cato paper called censorship by proxy, kind of trying to actually use things that beyond its normal power to job own or put pressure on these private actors. And that is something that should concern folks on both the left and the right, because it could be done from different political viewpoints in ways that could silence what may turn out to be very legitimate conversation.
And just to quickly add, because Jen brought up the offline world, like I want to also point out that this isn't really a new thing. Like, we've had a long-standing feeling among conservatives that, newspapers, the press are biased against them, universities the same way. And when you start seeing some of these behaviors that you feel like have been like prevalent for a century, starting to go to an online world, which is supposed to be free speech, where ideas are supposed to be, freely shared, I can see why people would be concerned about this and feel like we need to take some kind of action.
Since we've been talking a lot about allegations or concerns of censorship and free speech, have you seen the discussion around these topics change since, for example, Elon Musk's acquisition of Twitter, now X, or the launch of Trump's Truth Social as sort of a competitor to the existing mainstream social media platforms? Has the debate changed at all as a result of things like that, or is it, for the most part, stayed the same?
I think it's changed a little bit. I do think that Elon Musk purchasing Twitter and sort of that created an interesting sort of a backlash on both the left and the right. A lot of folks on the left have saw how he did reduce the amount of content they took down on the platform, and saw that as a huge negative. It ended up leaving up a lot of the kind of speech that they would rather sort of force platforms to take down. At the same time, I do think it did quiet a little bit of the urge on the right to use the government, at least slowed their role a little bit, so they could kind of explore what it looks like when a platform is moderated differently than they perceived. It was sort of perceived that all these other big platforms were sort of working in concert to censor certain kinds of speech. But at the same time, I think what really changed the debate a little bit was when the Twitter files came out. Those leaks came out showing that definitively that there was government attempts to force platforms, or at least lead platforms down the road of taking down certain whole categories of content, which was something that was suspected and it was often alleged, but this was the first time that it was definitively known that there was an organized sort of campaign within certain agencies to communicate to companies, you really ought to take this stuff down. And I think that has healthily shifted the debate a little bit more towards, okay, how do we stop, at the very least, these powerful platforms from being leveraged as a tool of the government, which is a genuine First Amendment concern? How do we stop that? How do we root that out and prevent that from happening again?
And I think in this regard, the courts have also been relevant too. When you look at, for example, the decision in the net choice cases around Florida and Texas's social media law, particularly Justice Kagan's decision that really kind of walks through what some of the consequences would be, but also some of the concurrences in that case as well. You saw quite a lineup on the net choice cases in a way that kind of seemed to signal to states that the Florida-Texas model of law, while it was remanded for further review, is unlikely to survive First Amendment scrutiny. And so I think what we have seen is a shift from some of these broader conversations around kind of revoke Section 230 or things like that, to things that are a bit more focused but could still have quite a number of consequences for speech. So on the one hand, we have seen this kind of what I think is actually a positive discussion about how do we address government job owning or the issues of government pressure on private actors. But we've also seen things like the youth online safety debate that oftentimes brings up issues of individual speech, whether it's young people's speech or the impact that these laws could have on adult users and their privacy and speech rights. We've seen a lot of conversation around the idea of anonymous speech online come up. We've also, from the left, seen a lot more conversation around kind of questions of mis and disinformation. And that's not exclusive to the left, but this, particularly as kind of AI has emerged, has become another part of the conversation as well. Are we starting to see things perhaps shift from conversations around social media to conversations around artificial intelligence? We've seen, bills that would call to revoke Section 230 from AI or from products using AI. We've also seen these conversations around quote unquote deep fakes or mis and disinformation, particularly in the election context. So I think that's probably been one of the changes we've seen in the last few years when it comes to the debate around online speech, at least.
And I mean, back to your original question, I think the fact that Musk did buy Twitter, and I think community notes, for example, has been a great change for the platform. It's a really good way of countering, bad posts, I guess, if you want to call them that, without actually taking it down or censoring. But he's also made changes a lot of people don't like, where marginalized communities might not feel safe. And I think one of the benefits for the current state of things is with Truth Social, with Elon taking over X and having other social media platforms like Blue Sky or Threads that people can go to, is that if you don't like the way a platform is moderating content, you have options to go to now. Like, it's something we've said for a long time, but now more than ever, we actually do have plenty of examples of different platforms, rivaling platforms with different moderation practices. And I think that is a good thing, because we don't necessarily want our platforms to moderate uniformly. Like, that's not necessarily good, because we want to experiment. We want to try different strategies and avenues for promoting speech. And I think, generally speaking, we're actually in a pretty good spot right now.
So, Jen, you mentioned Section 230, and I don't want to get too deep into the weeds because I have done whole webinars just dedicated to Section 230. But one of the earliest sort of controversies related to tech that I saw gaining a lot of steam among conservatives was sort of an anti-Section 230 attitude. This idea that Section 230 was enabling censorship by social media platforms. Some of that discussion, as you mentioned, Jennifer, has kind of died down or been replaced by other topics. Has this sort of change been a positive thing? Do we still see attacks on 230, or are we kind of out of the weeds there? And I want to ask Jennifer this question first.
So I don't think we're out of the woods there yet. And I think it's important to understand what Section 230 actually does. I think oftentimes it gets seen as this magic gift to tech companies that, is something that's completely different from the way First Amendment law or the way other liability regimes work. Basically, I think one of the core principles of Section 230 is something that many conservatives would find themselves applauding. It's something that says you have to sue the person who actually said it. You can't just go to the platform because they have deeper pockets and they provided a service that someone could say something on. If someone says something defamatory, if someone said something, that's harmful, you have to go to the person who actually said the thing, not the platform who's hosting it. And then the second part of Section 230 is that platforms can make content moderation decisions around objectionable content to serve their audience as needed. And this should be particularly valuable for conservatives, because this not only applies to general large platforms, the Twitters and the Facebooks of the world. It also applies to platforms like Truth Social. It also applies to platforms that may be serving, a particular religious group or trying to provide a particular kind of family-friendly atmosphere. So if you want to have a platform that, for example, is going to say we're not going to allow any profanity on this platform because it's against our values, then you can do that under Section 230. And in a world without Section 230, particularly those smaller platforms are really going to struggle with the potential liability. Even if they win out in court, even if it's proven that they were completely justified under the First Amendment to make the content moderation decision that they did, that's still going to be quite an expensive case. And that means it's going to be harder for new platforms to enter this market. It's going to be harder for startups to start in garages and dorm rooms that offer us all an opportunity to communicate. I think the other really misunderstood thing about Section 230 is it's not just about social media. User-generated content is so much broader on the internet. This includes things like review sites. This includes things like Wikipedia. This includes many other things that we've come to rely on, and to have such a pivotal law change could impact quite a bit of the online speech, not only from the platform's point of view, but also from a user's ability to both access information as well as to have their own voice out there.
And just on the 230 point, like 230 has enabled these platforms to host content that maybe they otherwise would take down because they don't want to be liable for it. We have the most accessible conservative content out there right now, probably because of Section 230. The internet as a means for communication enables conservative voices to get out like they never really could before. Obviously, we've had like talk radio, but there's never been this kind of tool where anyone really can just go out and become really, popular, famous, whatever you want to call it, and share those thoughts that maybe theoretically in the past weren't going to be on the front page of the local newspaper. So I think it's really important to remember for conservatives how valuable Section 230 is. And I think a lot of conservatives in this anti-tech movement have moved away from calling for just a blanket repeal and are now trying to focus on different narrow ways where they could, have their cake and eat it too. But it's still very important to remember that Section 230 benefits conservatives.
Yeah, just to put a very quick piece of punctuation on that, I like to remind, because there are still some conservatives out there who are still proposing to try to either repeal or gut or just strongly modify Section 230. And I like to point out the irony of the fact that at the same time that that former President Trump was declaring that he would repeal Section 230 if it was within his power, at that exact same time, his new website Truth Social was using Section 230 in court as its defense for moderation decisions they were making, because they kicked anyone off their platform who criticized Trump. And so, like Jeff says, a lot of these folks really want to have their cake and eat it too. It's a good talking point to use as sort of a bludgeon against these platforms. But when folks actually sit down and think about the cold reality of what the internet would look like without these protections, it becomes a little bit more, it does tend to change their behavior in their minds, at least a little bit.
On the subject of having your cake and eating it too, I think we've seen a lot of that mindset from both sides of the aisle when it comes to tech, wanting to shape the internet in a way that reflects their personal values and beliefs and allows the type of content and behavior that they like and doesn't allow the type of content and behavior that they don't like. I think both some conservatives and some liberals are equally guilty of this. How have we seen this type of cake eating mindset impact policy?
I mean, I think one place we see this is in this kind of calls to break up big tech or calls against big tech, because who you define as big tech has been really interesting over the last few years. And oftentimes when you look at, for example, the numbers that are actually in these bills, because they want to apply to Twitter or X, they're also bringing in companies like Reddit or Snapchat that are not typically thought of as big tech companies and might have a very different kind of way of interacting. In fact, when you look at some of the state bills, they've even potentially brought in services like Rumble as an alternative video platform streaming service that was popular with conservatives. So I think that, one of the places we even see this is in the language, this kind of narrative that's been constructed that big tech is a certain group of companies and it's always going to be that certain group of companies. But even in the years that this kind of anti-tech sentiment has been rising, who those companies are has already shifted to some degree. And then particularly if you start to look at kind of broader conversations or at what's going on with Gen Z, it's TikTok part of this conversation. As I mentioned, is Snap or Snapchat part of this conversation. These are type of things that are relevant to some of these debates when we're talking particularly about online speech, as well as when we're talking about the way that antitrust could potentially be targeted at certain companies, and also how it could be targeted in the offline context. So, for example, when we're talking about retail and self-preferencing or things like that, are things that going to apply to Amazon, also going to apply to places like Target or CVS. And so when we see this conversation around tech, oftentimes the proponents of these policy changes have one group of companies in mind, but when you look at the actual underlying policy, it's going to be much more broadly impactful to the economy, to a number of companies, to a number of industries than sometimes how it's portrayed.
And I focused a little bit more on the content side so far, and so I'm going to continue to do that. But I think the other kind of aspect of all this is that, Josh and Jen can talk more about the state bills in particular, but as I remember them, they're trying to basically say we're going to allow or we're going to prevent companies from moderating political content. So that way political voices get out. well, there's a lot of political quote unquote content that's really bad. Like I saw just recently, there was like a Twitch streamer or something who was like hoping that all American soldiers got PTSD, and everyone was like, let's take this down right away. I guarantee you a lot of those conservatives who are trying to say we should allow all political speech want that content taken down. So how do you design a state law or any law that says, well, we have to allow political speech and you can't be biased, and then, well, we also want you to take down this, because it's obviously really bad thing to be saying, but trying to draw that distinction, these state laws are kind of trying, like I said, having their cake and eating it too. How do you build a law that could do that? It just doesn't really make a lot of sense to me.
And Jeff, if I can just hop in on that point really quick before Josh hops in here, some of these proposals even take it farther than political to ideological viewpoints or things that are much broader. And I just think about, I grew up in Alabama, and I can tell you during football season, there are some very strongly held ideological viewpoints that are expressed on various platforms about the SEC versus everyone, or about, Alabama versus Georgia, or we just had the Alabama-Tennessee game. I don't want to talk about it, but that these are the type of things that I don't think policymakers necessarily have in mind. And then you think, well, how many legitimate discussions on really important issues of the day involve some element of politics in this day and age, or involve some element of viewpoint? You could very quickly have something that's taking down far more content than I think a lot of people assume that it would take down.
Yeah, and the only thing I'll add to that is that, to sort of punctuate that is I've often thought it would be almost a useful experiment, except it would probably also be traumatizing for people to have to experience what complying with one of these viewpoint neutrality laws like Texas passed would look like in practice. In that, just like what both Jeff and Jen have said, there is an awful lot of sort of non-illegal, sort of awful speech that platforms take down as a matter of course that you don't ever get to experience on the platform, because they take it down because they know that people don't want to see it. And things like, sort of abusive, hateful, racist, profane, just abusive sort of speech, the type of stuff that if somebody were to say this to you in a public forum, you would be shocked and appalled, but people feel free to do it on the internet because of the distance. And if people were to see, I kind of almost dare people to go to a platform that is almost totally unmoderated, like a 4chan or something like that, and see what the unmoderated internet actually looks like, where viewpoint neutrality is actually allowed, and to the extent that they don't take down pretty much anything that's except for what's illegal. And it's awful. The reason why people want to be on these platforms is partially because it is a slightly safer, slightly more curated experience. And if they don't want that experience, there are other platforms they can go to and get that.
And to Josh's point, what it really creates is a return of what's called the moderator's dilemma. In a world without these kind of broader liability certainties, platforms are faced with one of two choices. Some platforms will go the way Josh mentioned, in terms of they're going to allow everything regardless of if it's, racist, because it could be a viewpoint and therefore they can no longer take it down. Other platforms are going to go a much more restrictive way, in that they're going to take down any content, including content that would have been previously allowed, including conservative voices as well as progressive voices, in order to make sure that we're just not going to allow any conversation on these issues at all, lest we find ourselves subject to the law's penalties. And so you kind of get a either no lifeguard on duty situation, or a situation that involves a lot more speech being silenced, including very important political speech in the process.
We actually have an audience question that I think ties into the conversation we're having now really well. I want to remind the audience, you can put any of your questions in the Slido link that's in the event description, regardless of where you're watching. But we have an audience question that asks, why would it be wrong to use a tool like the Fairness Doctrine and apply it to social media?
Can I just start by saying that the Fairness Doctrine has been overturned for good reason, or at least repealed. And there is a lot of talk about a current rule, the news distortion rule at the FCC, which has similar First Amendment concerns that we don't need to weigh into too much here. But I just want to point out that a lot of these tools that we've used in the past didn't work that well. And for the fairness doctrine in particular, it was, for those who don't know, is basically you have to, if you give one candidate a particular amount of time on a radio broadcast or television broadcast, you have to give the other person fair access, the other idea fair access, those kind of things. It's just, there's a lot of First Amendment concerns with some of these tools. And I think more than ever, we've got plenty of ways to reach Americans with communications, and we shouldn't be having the government step in and essentially dictate what we can and can't say, because that's where the mischief really starts to become serious.
Yeah, and I like to point out the irony too and I know that it's been a few decades since this was the current topic, and so there's probably a lot of folks who don't remember this, but I'm almost too young to remember when this debate was current. But repealing the fairness doctrine was a major cause célèbre on the right among conservatives, partially for the perception and really the reality that it was being used to sort of force in some ways sort of suppression of some conservative voices, because like for example, the popularity of right-wing speakers on talk radio, because of the fairness doctrine, there was a certain amount of airtime that was being forced to be taken up with content people really weren't looking for, because of the way that was being enforced. And so the irony now that a lot of sort of ideologically the same crowd that was one of the reasons, was some of the impetus behind the fairness doctrine being taken down, aside from its just flagrant First Amendment concerns, are now sort of wanting to do the same thing to the internet. And at its core, what you're doing is you're empowering the government to be the ones to decide what is fair, what is neutral. And I think it's a little odd that the same crowd that I think rightfully distrusts the government and so for being biased against their points of view, and I think that's true on both the left and the right, are also wanting to empower them to be the arbiters of what fair free speech is.
The only thing I would add to this conversation, Josh and Jeff covered a lot of the points, is a reminder that this would apply to those specialized platforms as well, including specialized platforms that might be trying to serve a conservative audience. So applying a fairness doctrine to the internet is also going to apply to a platform like Truth Social. It's also going to apply to a platform that may be saying that it's going to apply Catholic values, or it's going to be only family-friendly content. Fairness doctrine isn't only going to apply to the platforms you don't like. And I think that's also important for those on the left who might feel like similar calls are needed, that this would also, that applying a fairness doctrine could also force, say, a platform serving the LGBTQ community to host homophobic content, the same way that it could force a platform serving the Jewish community to host anti-Semitic content. And that in most cases, people can see the reason that a community might want to have its own online space that it knows is going to have information aligned with its own values.
So another theme that has already shown up a lot in our discussion is competition, this hatred of bigness, and especially when it comes to big tech, which Jennifer mentioned can be somewhat of an arbitrary category. I want to talk about the phenomenon of quote unquote conservatives named for their support or at least sometimes agreement with FTC Commissioner Lina Khan over breaking up big tech companies. Where do you think this support or agreement comes from? I want to start with Josh.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I think it mostly comes from a fairly unprincipled place, and sort of in that the folks who are most supportive of sort of the same policies that Lina Khan is doing with respect to antitrust, people like Josh Hawley, for example, are mostly basing it on populism, just a hatred of these companies and the perception that they're somehow corrosive to conservative values and to society, and that they're being biased in the way that they treat them, and so they want to punish these companies. And antitrust is the absolute most powerful tool, well, one of the most powerful tools the government has to regulate economic activity. And but I do think there is a little bit of, and I think Jen was the one who brought this up earlier, was that there's a little bit of a legitimate movement to where there are some conservatives who are just perceiving that any sort of overly centralized power is a threat to liberty in the same way that the government can be. And I think that's a flawed logic in that, power that's centralized in the government can be used to lock you up, to forcibly take your money, to repress you in very direct ways. Whereas, commerce is voluntary. You don't have to patronize Google or Amazon or Facebook if you don't want to. And there are alternatives to those platforms. Also, there is actually vigorous competition, even among these big tech platforms, so that you're not being forced to patronize any of these services. But that perception is. I think it's understandable. It's a gut perception that goes back a century or more to sort of the Gilded Age. This perception that any sufficiently large company wields a sort of power that we need to be wary of in some way.
Well,
Go
and
ahead,
it's sorry, Jeff.
No, it's saying go ahead.
Actually, the ITIF president, Rob Atkinson, had a great op-ed in the Wall Street Journal today about how these calls to dismantle Google could actually risk undermining U.S. competitiveness. And I think this is interesting, as I mentioned earlier, when we consider the international dynamic. At the same time that we have the movement from the conservatives, as you said, or folks here in the U.S. to potentially dismantle these companies that have been prime examples of U.S. Global success. We're seeing also that the Europeans are trying to regulate American companies because, in part, they haven't been able to compete with them. It's a very much an approach that is targeting American companies. And that is one place where we've seen important conservative voices at times speak out of recognizing this problematic behavior when it's coming from Europe, is that we're seeing this kind of global push to regulate companies, not because they've engaged in behavior harming consumers, but because there's been this idea of this arbitrary threshold set that a company of a certain size should automatically be subject to more government regulation. And if we look historically, governments are really bad at predicting winners and losers, and they're really bad at predicting the future. We've seen things like, blocking mergers of video rental stores at the same time that things like Netflix are starting to emerge. We've seen folks who never predicted Amazon's emergence in the e-commerce space. And we've seen that this is happening even now when we think about, for example, the social media dynamic, that we're seeing it focus on Facebook, which is losing huge popularity, particularly with Gen Z. And at a time where the overall ecosystem of technology is changing again, and that innovation has continued to be our best competition policy, whether it's innovation from these large companies competing with one another, or innovation in the sense of something that's going to be incredibly disruptive that none of us could have predicted a few years ago.
I'll just take a slightly different approach here to say that I don't mind the antitrust agencies bringing cases. I actually think it's a good thing to bring cases when you think there's competitive harms. And I think a lot of these companies, they're integrating so many different services that they do raise some, at least concern flags that we should look more closely. The problem I'm seeing is that the Biden administration's approach has been, well, let's ignore the analysis of, do they have monopoly power? Can they control prices? What kind of anti-competitive conduct are they using to maintain or acquire that monopoly? Doing the rigorous economic analysis, looking at the competitive effects, both pro-competitive, anti-competitive, doing that full analysis, and instead saying, well, they're just too big. We're going to say that this is an anti-competitive harm because they acquired a company. That's a problem in and of itself, because now they have more concentration in the market. I think when you do the analysis, you'll find that a lot of the conduct of these companies is very pro-competitive, as Josh and Jen were saying. But I don't mind in isolation bringing the case. It's just a lot of these cases are starting to get to the point where it's like, there's a few that I think are pretty solid cases that they have some good merit, and there's some that I think are just, we're going to throw at the wall and see what sticks, because this company in particular, we don't like what they did 10 years ago, and now we're going to go after them because, again, they've gotten too big. So I think there's an important distinction to be made, which is just to say that the antitrust laws should exist, and we should prevent monopolists from illegally maintaining or acquiring that power. But we really need to be focused on the economics and the competitive effects and not changing the standards to just saying big is bad.
I would like to perhaps disagree with Jeff a little bit here, or perhaps clarify his point. Maybe is a better answer. I do have concerns that some of these cases are being brought on theories that are not based in sound economics and sound principles of antitrust law. And while there may be a place for antitrust in protecting consumers as a kind of hypothetical idea there, I do think there could be serious consequences of unprincipled antitrust cases, just in terms of, we know that's when we look at what happened with Microsoft. Microsoft is often held up as the example of the tech antitrust case of times past. But we also know in some ways Microsoft missed mobile because it was busy fighting antitrust cases at the time. What are we going to miss out on as consumers because companies are either being advised not to launch certain products, not to launch certain services, because they could find themselves subject to further antitrust scrutiny, or because companies have limited resources, and therefore if they're dedicating those resources to legal teams, they're not able to dedicate them to innovation themselves. So this idea that, even if companies, as long as the companies are winning in court, I do agree it's important, and it's good that we've seen many of these theories that would shift away from the consumer welfare standard lose in court. Those cases themselves are not without cost. And when we look at the number of cases that are adding up and the effect that could have beyond the tech companies that are subject to them, are you going to see an impact on acquisitions more generally? Are you going to see an impact on venture capital out of kind of a broader chilling effect that unnecessarily aggressive antitrust could have on the industry?
Yeah, I don't think we disagree on that.
And if there's a moment, I'd interject one more thing, which is that I do think that and it's certainly, I hope, but certainly among lawmakers, the folks who are outright with, like Lena Khan, the folks who are like outright willing to say yes, we should practice this extremely sort of progressive intervention into the economy and just start breaking up all the big companies, are a relative minority. But I do worry that the trends that they believe that they're following is sort of a fundamental repudiation of one of the central pillars of what used to be conservatism, which is this idea that limited government is a high-end priority of sort of a free society, and that that liberty is in some ways an end, and the restraints that currently exist on antitrust power that based on court precedents, the sort of what we call the consumer welfare standard that exists now, was one of the very, very few true large-scale victories that the conservative movement ever has had in terms of restricting the size and scope of government power over the last half century. And what these conservatives are touting is essentially a 180 on that progress, one of the few bounds we've ever actually managed to place on the state.
That actually brings up a big question that I especially chose the three of you for this event. It wasn't just because you all have J names. It was because your own views, having interacted with a lot of your work, and the views of your organizations are very pro-individual liberty, pro-limited government, pro-free market. And so the ultimate question kind of that I wanted to ask all of you is, these proposals or ideas that we've seen from anti-tech conservatives calling for more regulation or more government intervention in response to big tech or free speech or censorship concerns on social media, how do these fit with conservative principles of free markets and limited government? Do you see this as a shift in some conservatives' priorities, or is there some other trend going on?
I guess I'll jump in. I mean, I worry that this does represent a shift. I don't know how widespread it is, but anecdotally from a lot of the people that I know, and some of whom sort of fellow travelers in sort of like the Tea Party movement. I started my career actually with a conservative organization, Freedom Works, and sort of conservative grassroots movement. And I have seen what I consider to be a very worrying trend in sort of the order of priorities of some of these folks, many of whom were sort of identified very strongly with libertarian values a decade ago, having shifted their focus towards sort of this sort of Manichaean struggle of the culture war being more important, and that essentially victory against the left and what they consider to be ideological problems with them is now more important than upholding core tenets of individual liberty like free markets. I do think that has infected the movement to a certain extent writ large. I obviously disagree with that, and I'd like to remind them that authoritarianism in your direction can any power that you invest in the government in order to just defeat your enemies now can then be swung around and used against you. And that's one of the reasons why sort of liberty and individual freedom have generally been the priority of anybody who values a free society. But I do. It's a worrying trend, and one that I don't think is necessarily going away anytime soon.
To build on some of this question, one of the interesting things is, of course, power, once it's given to an agency, once it's given to the government, is very hard to get back. It's very hard, for Congress to rein in power that it's given to the FTC or things like that. We've seen some of that struggle going on recently with calls for various hearings over concerns, it seems, that various policymakers have over recent FTC actions. I think there is a presumption at times on both sides of the aisle that it will always be their version of the right people in power. And that's actually not the question policymakers should be asking when they're thinking about giving the power to regulate an industry or changing something like antitrust laws that could expand much more broadly than perhaps the industry they have in mind. The question shouldn't be, am I comfortable with the government having this power when my side, when the people I like have this power? The question should be, am I comfortable with the government having this power when the person I most disagree with is the one who gets to make this decision? And I think that would provide a lot more reflection over why, when we're giving potentially the government power over things like online speech, when we're giving them the power to decide the size of an industry or what areas of an industry a company can go into, that's something that should give a lot more people pause, regardless of where they fall on the political spectrum.
I've got nothing to add.
So kind of to wrap this line of many different topics up before we turn to audience questions. We've seen, again, a rise of anti-tech sentiment on both sides of the aisle, and we've seen policymakers or other stakeholders from both sides of the aisle coming to some of the same conclusions when it comes to tech, even though they're coming from very different value and belief systems. How likely do you think it is that anti-tech conservatives' proposed solutions would achieve what their goals are? And insofar as maybe some of their proposed solutions would not turn out the way that they expect, is there a better way that they could go about achieving better solutions?
So one of the interesting dynamics here is, as was kind of mentioned at the beginning, we see these debates over, say, online speech from both the left and the right, but from two very different reasons. There are certain times where we've seen both sides of the aisle come together on what they see as smaller reforms. So I brought up earlier, for example, youth online safety issues, because many people with good intentions, not even necessarily anti-tech intentions, want to help improve things for young people online. But when you look at the actual consequences of those bills, that could actually make things even harder for some of the most marginalized young people online, young people in foster care or trying to escape abusive home situations, young people who might not otherwise have a way to stay in touch with friends and family, who may feel very isolated, and that may be where they've found community. And so I think, oftentimes it's a question of where are those areas where there are similar discourse, and what are the potential consequences of those particular proposals. Like I mentioned with youth online safety, we also have issues of privacy and government access that are things that particularly conservatives, as well as those on the left, have often been expressing concerns about government access to data or things like that. When it comes to the issues like the bills we saw in Florida and Texas, as Josh and I discussed earlier in this event, you have kind of a moderator's dilemma reemerge, where you could either see many more conservative voices being silenced, in terms of removing a lot more content, including conservative content, or you could see a lot of content left up that conservatives wouldn't want to see.
Yeah. Go ahead, Jeff.
I was just going to say that, I know we're running out of time, so I'll be pretty quick here. But I think generally speaking, it's very difficult for people to accept that sometimes the best thing to do is nothing. Because there are harms that are going on, and it's just a lot of the proposed solutions are going to cause more harm than they're going to help. So we get to these situations where it's like the kids' safety is a great example. We do have kids that are struggling, and a lot of content they see online might affect their well-being, and we think, okay, that means we have to go and make sure that the platforms regulate more. Well, every proposal ends up making the problem worse. It ends up saying, well, we're going to remove any kind of helpful content because now it could lead to liability. We're going to eliminate a voice for community that you used to be able to have an outlet and feel connected to. So it's a growing challenge, I think. And a lot of the time, I don't think that there's necessarily a government policy solution. It's maybe something where we just, publicly work with the companies more to make more resources available, or have public-private partnerships, stuff like that can, work together to solve some of these things that we don't necessarily need government regulation. But it's hard to say that's not a solution that people are okay with. And I don't have a good answer there, but it's just something I've been kind of wrapping my head around and trying to struggle through a little bit.
Yeah, the kids online safety is probably one of the best examples of sort of the left and the right coming together in actually enacting policies. Potentially even it's gotten very close to happening at the federal level. And the one thing I'd say, especially to a conservative audience there, it's hard to say. But this is where they need to embrace a little bit more of the sort of individual responsibility for tackling this question. And that sounds harsh, but there's the parents have an incredible amount of power actually to control how their kids interact with devices and the internet and all that kind of stuff. I think sometimes they don't realize that they have it, and that's maybe a shortcoming on the part of both companies and maybe advocates like ourselves to make that. And so I think there's been a push now to sort of remind parents that the tools to actually regulate how how their kids experience technology are there. They just need to know where they are, and that's where maybe public education on both. There's maybe an obligation on maybe even some of the state governments, but also definitely on the part of the companies to make sure that folks are aware that they have that power to control that experience, and that's going to overall end up being a better experience for everybody, and going to do a lot more to actually mitigate the harms than any of these government policies that get passed.
Yeah, I will say the one thing I regret about not having more time with you all today is I would love to, in the future, be able to dig specifically into these children's online safety and children on social media questions. And I will say for people watching this webinar today, ITIF will have an event covering some of those child-specific issues. So keep your eye on our social media and on our newsletter for when we schedule that event, because it is coming up. But we only have a couple minutes left. And so I have one question from the audience here, coming back to the international side of things that Jen mentioned at the top. Have we seen anti-tech policies passing in other countries around the world? And how has that sort of played out there? Have they been successful? Have they led to a world that we might want to emulate here in the US, or are they more of a cautionary tale?
So I would say right now they are much more of a cautionary tale. And we've typically seen on the left a lot of support for very European style policies in the past, things like the Digital Markets Act and to a lesser degree, the Digital Services Act. So particularly around, for example, the antitrust issue. And that goes to some of the concerns we've seen about, for example, FTC Chair Lina Khan and working with Brussels to potentially help with the enforcement of the Digital Markets Act against American tech companies where they aren't currently succeeding in US courts. I do think there is kind of another interesting story there, though, and that has to do with the online safety bill out of the UK. And this is a case that, again, going back to that youth online safety issue, where we have seen this brought up not only in kind of left-leaning circles, but also from conservative voices on the right, the kind of idea of, well, if the UK did this, they're somewhat similar to us. Why is it wrong for us to look at this in the US? And that goes to some of the concerns about, one, there's a very different legal standard around free speech, and the First Amendment being a prime example of some of the differences in the US and UK policy. But there's also a question of what would this mean in terms of the actual innovation, both in tools that help keep young people safe, as well as for various things around online speech. And so kind of rushing to perhaps copy a bill that neither fits US legal norms nor has fully considered some of the trade-offs here in the US, I think is perhaps one area of concern where we've seen that international influence.
I know we're out of time, but just one quick point also. It's easy, on X or whatever platform to kind of dunk on Europe a lot of time because they'll do something which is, not a good policy. And then we have good stories coming out like new AI features aren't deploying in Europe. Look, this is what happens. I think it's important to remember that Europe is one of our closest allies. A lot of these European countries are close allies, and they're actively harming their tech sector in a time where, the global situation isn't necessarily the best. So I just think it's important to remember that they are actively harming their tech sector, and that is a national security issue. And I think they're starting to kind of grapple with that, but it's something we need to be very cognizant of as we start trying to emulate Europe.
All right. Well, I apologize to everyone for going a little bit over time, but I think we had a really great discussion today. I want to thank my panelists for your time and insight. I want to thank everyone who tuned in online and everyone who comes back to watch the VOD later. I think this has been a great discussion, and I hope to have more discussions like this in the future.
Thank you.